Let me also go across to Michael Kugelman, South Asia columnist, who joins us on the broadcast as well. Mr. Kugelman, how much of this is about tariffs and trade deficits, and how much is it tied to India's relationship with Russia?
Well, I think it's a combination of both. I do think that we're seeing the president injecting geopolitics into his decisions about trade and tariffs. President Trump is much more a hard line now than he was in his first term when it comes to his willingness to apply as much pressure as possible on other countries to try to get them to better help and advance U.S. economic interests. I think that's why, it's one reason why he is willing to apply these tariffs on India. President Trump has long been concerned about what he describes as India's very high tariffs. He's long described India as a tariff king. And India does have tariffs that, from a U.S. perspective, would be seen as high, not as high as some of its closest allies and partners, but still high. So I do think that, there is that dimension to it. But I do think that geopolitics are really impacting the president's thinking in a big way. The president really wants to see Russia agree to a ceasefire in its war in Ukraine. It's very unhappy that it has not been willing to do so. And so I think that President Trump is essentially trying to pressure Russia by pressuring India. He's trying to convince India, a close trade partner and a close partner on the whole with Russia, to essentially distance itself from Russia in the hopes that that would compel Russia to stop fighting its war in Ukraine. So unfortunately, I do think this is a case where India is getting dragged into these concerns that President Trump is having about Russia, his frustration about Russia's unwillingness to this point to stop fighting in Ukraine.
Mr. Kugelman, historically, has the United States backed down from a similar tariff stances when they were met with coordinated pushback, for example, via the WTO or coalitions like BRICS? Do you see that happening?
It does seem that President Trump is very defiant and that he is not inclined to pull back from his decision to apply these tariffs. But that said, it is absolutely true that we could see a change. I mean, President Trump himself has tended to be someone who changes his mind quite frequently. I mean, if we just go back a bit earlier this year, soon after he announced the initial reciprocal tariffs on many countries, including India, he announced that there would be a pause. So I do think that we should see these tariffs as a pressure tactic, and that he hopes that by announcing these very high tariffs, that it will compel countries that are victimized by them, including India, to make concessions and do things that would ease President Trump's concerns about how these countries impact U.S. economic interests. But that said, India has clearly already made a lot of concessions to the U.S. Earlier this year, it reduced some key tariffs on goods that related to the U.S. So it's hard to say. And President Trump is very unpredictable, so it's very difficult to predict what exactly could come next. But at least at this point, he appears to be unwilling to back down with these tariffs.
Okay, finally, the coming together of the BRICS nations, what does that mean in the larger context?
I think that the danger for President Trump is that the very outcomes that he most wishes to avoid could actually come into play. Clearly, President Trump is unhappy with BRICS. He thinks that it represents an effort to create alternative economic models that would go against the U.S. dollar. And I would argue that to this point, those efforts have been unsuccessful. BRICS has been unable to create a BRICS bank. But by alienating all of these countries in BRICS, or should I say by upsetting all of these countries in BRICS by slapping these high tariffs on them, I would argue that the BRICS states now have a stronger incentive to try to push forward and develop some type of model that would shield them from U.S. tariffs, that would avoid the U.S. dollar, and that even though they had previously been unwilling to take such steps because of their dependence on the U.S. dollar, given how serious the situation has become, I would argue that there might be a stronger motivation on the BRICS states to put together these alternative mechanisms, these alternative economic mechanisms that would compete with the dollar. That's the very outcome that President Trump would most like to avoid.
All right, let me quickly go across to Mr. Mark Linscott as well, the Senior Advisor, US-India Strategic Ties Forum, and he has been listening to us very patiently. Mr. Linscott, I want to understand the US position. From your perspective, what are the underlying strategic motives behind President Trump's refusal to resume any sort of trade talks with India at this moment?
Well, in fact, I am not aware of a definitive, a clear refusal to engage in further trade talks. I mean, it's clear that the president thrives on chaos and uncertainty. He's pulling out all the stops to leverage, to squeeze, to even bully to address his objectives, which I think are twofold. The one that has emerged so suddenly is Indian purchases of Russian oil and his efforts to resolve the Russian-Ukraine conflict. But the longer-term one, or the one that's been on our minds for the last few months, is the effort on trade and to reach at least an interim agreement on trade. So I hope that those doors are still open for further negotiations, and I think they may be.
Okay. So how do you think the United States perceives the growing coordination within the BRICS nation? Could a deeper India, Brazil, China, Russia economic cooperation escalate tensions with Washington, or do you think it can also serve as a leverage in negotiations?
Yeah, it's a bit of an ironic situation. I've long been a skeptic of the ability of those nations to be able to align, coordinate, cooperate on trade. The interests are just so different in many respects. I mean, certainly with China and India, and even on agriculture between Brazil and India, there are some significant differences in approaches to trade. So I've been a skeptic. It's clear that there is more discussion among the BRICS nations to work more on trade, particularly given the threats from the Trump administration. But I don't think that's going to proceed very quickly. On the other hand, the president reacts immediately and aggressively and very provocatively with new threats of new tariffs associated with any discussions among the BRICS to coordinate more closely and to respond to the threats from Trump. So we have this situation in which perhaps the threat really is not that substantial, that significant or imminent, yet the response is very aggressive.
Okay, Mr. Linscott, let's also talk about the long-term trade strategy here. How should India balance its strategic autonomy, for example, its ties with Russia, with the commercial necessity of maintaining strong US market access as well?
Yeah, it's a very difficult balancing act, and I think it's going to remain a balancing act. India, for years, has emphasized its approach as being strategic autonomy. It's a sovereign nation. It's in a very different place in the world and in the United States. Its geopolitical situation is different than that of the United States or even the Europeans for that matter. Yet, the United States market is hugely important. It's nearly 20% of India's exports. There would be significant economic pain if that market were to be closed off. And I want to emphasize the United States has strong interests, or should have strong interests, in maintaining this relationship as well, both from a strategic and an economic standpoint. That the Indian market at 1.4 billion is just too large to ignore. Last week I was with U.S. agricultural producers, and they see the Indian market as critical for them in the future. So there is that interest on the United States as well. We're just not hearing it from the Trump administration at this point in time.
Okay, so in your view, what should India's, say, for example, top 3 trade diversification priorities be in order to reduce this over-reliance on the US market?
Yes, I think that makes sense. And in fact, it's been clear for some years now that India has been focused on diversifying its trade, certainly negotiating free trade agreements with a broader number of trading partners, including developed country trading partners. It was a real accomplishment to conclude the free trade agreement with India, which has now been concluded. So, I think that is an effort that's been ongoing and one that should continue. I don't think it's unique to India, however. I think that, all nations are interested in ensuring that they have strategic trade, that they are trading with trusted partners. Unfortunately, we have a situation now with the Trump administration that it's hard to continue that trust, that to maintain that access to the U.S. market, particularly given the fact that the president can change course at any moment. Tariffs go up. They don't seem to be going down at this point in time, but they go up. New tariffs are applied. So it's becoming, I think, more difficult to maintain that access to the U.S. market, but it remains essential. I mean, that I don't think India can do as well as it's been doing economically without continuing access to the U.S. market. Perhaps over the long term, it could diversify out of the U.S. market, but not anytime soon. And I don't think it would be desirable for both countries.
All right, Mark Linscott, Michael Kugelman, Professor Steve Hanke, and Robert Moran, thank you very much for speaking to NDTV, for sharing your views. And it is going to be quite interesting to see how things unfold from here.